So thank you all for joining us with our guests here, Aditya Nigam. We are going to discuss today decolonization theory. So the title of our discourse is A Discourse on Decolonization Theory. We got an august group of scholars with us. And this discourse is sponsored by the Institute for Critical Social Theory, which is a institute that we put together in 2021 to bring together scholars from all over the world who are working on a variety of different issues so that we can collaborate on them, on projects, we can bounce ideas off each other, we can continue to grow, bring in more people, and truly have a global discourse as to a discourse of that it only remains local. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming and for listening, and we look forward to your input and your questions. And I'll hand it over to our scholar today, Aditya Nigam.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be and pleased to be here for this opportunity, as Javad was saying, of talking across continents across the globe. So I'll try and just flag a few issues in the next 20 minutes or so. Which are all there in the book, but basically some of those things might need a little bit of background also. So one thing which actually any reader from outside India reading the book might want to ask, and that is, I think, the key issue for us right now. Might want to ask why there is a lot of time spent with a particular point of view, which is now associated with our ruling dispensation. The divide between what is colonizing, what is colonial, and what is decolonizing is not that simple or easy. Like everything else in India, everything is messy. So this too is very messy. And so if I were to just give you an instance, all the lower caste movements of from the late 19th century onwards through the 20th century, very powerful movements, very powerful, important figures leading them, including B.R. Ambedkar, who's now known, of course, across the globe. But there's a whole array of leaders from the late 19th century onwards who are actually using the presence of colonial power and the discourse of equality that became available thanks to the presence of the colonial power to settle their accounts with the local elites, which were the Brahminical elites, the local caste elites. And so if I were to just kind of illustrate it with a very dramatic example around which the current regime has actually framed many activists in completely false cases. So there was a battle in 1880, which is called the Battle of Bhima Koregaon, which is a village in alongside a river in Western India. Now, in that, the Mahar regiment, which is the lowest among the untouchable castes in Maharashtra, in that part of Western India, were part of the British Army, the Mahar regiment, which along with the British Army, defeated the local Brahminical state, which was called the Peshwas. And that is an incident, or that is an episode which is celebrated every year. So 2018 was 200 years of the Bhima Koregaon War, in which the Mahars fought alongside the British to defeat the local elites, right? And so Dr. Ambedkar actually became one of the, I mean, he celebrated it. He saw this as a very, very important milestone in the process of Dalit liberation. Dalit is the current name, the political self-description of the untouchable, former untouchable caste. So here then there is one of the fault lines becomes very clear, which is that the minute we talk of decolonization, we are actually looking at what the current regime and proponents of the current regime have actually, a slogan they have picked up. And they have now very much, some of them are now very much keyed into global decolonial discourse and so on, some of their leading lights. So decolonization in that kind of dominant understanding, which ties up also with a certain kind of earlier nationalist, early 20th century anti-colonial imagination, was basically to replace the colonial with the Brahminical. I'll now use the term Brahminical for shorthand. So I think so that we don't, I don't keep expanding on the same point. So just bear this term in mind. Now, so that is why the lower caste movements, lower caste intellectuals and activists who are associated, especially the Dalit Bahujan. The Bahujan is the larger category. The Dalits are the former untouchables, and Bahujans are the the larger category, within which some are relatively untouchable, some are not. Now, they have actually made it, so they are very suspicious of anything which talks about decolonization. Because to them, decolonization actually, in a way, brings in or smuggles in, rather, the Brahminical viewpoint. So the point for us here is a double-edged fight. The fight is not just against the modernists who rejected under colonial and modern knowledge, under the influence of colonial and modern knowledge, who rejected the various forms of indigenous knowledges and cultures. So that was one kind of deracinated elite which was produced by the colonial power, and by what one would call in Anibal Kuhano's terms, by the colonial matrix of power. Now, while that is there is simultaneously also, and especially in the last, I would say 30 years, but more specifically, if one looks at it in the last 10, 15 years, this has actually become a very strong counter voice, a counter imagination, which is challenging the idea of an Indian culture or an Indian knowledge systems and knowledge traditions, which were basically Brahminical. So there are now voices which are basically, and important voices which are now basically challenging that entire construction and insisting on the fact that there was not one Indian tradition, which is always by default identified as Brahminical. Now, this I should also briefly, just in a minute or two, refer to the fact that the early 20th century nationalist imagination, and which was actually reinforced by a lot of very serious intellectual work by many intellectuals who I have named also in the book, but the entire effort of the nationalists was, in a way, to show that we are not lagging behind the colonialists. Whatever the colonialists have today, we always had. We didn't have it. We even had it in the Vedic times. So basically, it was a kind of way of saying that uh, we are in a way were always far more advanced. And so it was a lot of it. If you had Machiavelli in the 15th, 16th, 15th century, we had a Kautilya who was like 15 centuries before Machiavelli. So now Kautilya actually is a thinker and also a strategist uh, who his key text, the Arthashastra, which is literally in today's language means economy, but in the time when it was written, it means combination of wealth and power. It's a word which is quite similar in its implications to the word dawla or dawlat in Arabic, which refers both to wealth and power. Now, that Kautilyan text is actually quite a secular text. It doesn't invoke religious injunctions or anything. All this thing about, so that is the other point I want to make, which is that early on in this process, the Orientalist Indological distinction, or not that I would say their key premise of the materialist West versus the spiritualist East and spiritualist India in particular was ingrained. It was actually internalized by Indian nationalists in the early 20th century. So that continues till today. It is almost as if there was nothing happening in India except except religiosity and spiritualism and so on and so forth. So now there was actually an attempt by some Gandhian scholars and some others, non-Marxist socialists, to actually excavate traditions of science and technology before colonialism. Somewhat along the lines, not in such an ambitious way as Joseph Needham did with regard to science and civilization in China. But it wasn't as successful as that. But there was obviously a lot of some material was produced. But there is also another kind of sorry. Sorry, got a big. I was talking about the science and technology. So there's another kind of effort undertaken by a Marxist philosopher, Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay, who wrote on science and society in ancient India. He was basically a scholar of Indian philosophy, and a lot of his work actually is around the philosophical traditions in India, but he focuses more on the materialist traditions, which are actually quite powerful traditions. So the point I'm trying to make in short is that this two levels of at which we actually need to first dismantle in the Indian context the binaries of the Orientalist Indological discourse. The first, which instated in the name of, now this was also carried out under the impact of the 19th century romantic philosophy, romanticists, German philosophers also, that in a sense there was a valorization of the pre-colonial Indian, which was not, of course, pre-colonial in India for 800, 900 years was Islamic also. But obviously, they were not referring to that. They were always referring to a certain Hindu past. And that became a kind of talisman for our nationalists also. So that was one. The second thing was this overarching divide between the materialist West and the spiritualist East and spiritualist India. Now, to get out of this, we actually need to also look at, and that is one of the reasons why I've spent a lot of time in the 3 chapters in the book in which I deal with three specific concepts around which I think the story of modernity all over the world can be retold, but specifically in India, the shape it takes. The first is the question of the political, where we have the idea of the political coming to us from Europe in a way where it is basically the separation of or disestablishment of the church, which makes available the idea of the political as an object of independent inquiry. Now, that is not something, if we look at Indian traditions, never. Even the Kautilyan text I referred to you was not a Vedic text. It was not a religious text. It is actually a completely secular text. We may have other criticisms of it. And the places where every chapter, now a lot of work has happened on this, every chapter of that book has interpolations which have appeared later. This is people who have studied, scholars like Patrick Olivelle, who've studied 150 versions of the recensions of the Arthashastra, will tell us that these are interpolations of a later period where the king is enjoined at the end of each chapter. You have a completely, which doesn't fit with the rest of the text, of how the king has to protect the fourfold Brahminical order. So that I think you're all aware of. I won't go into the details of that. But the Brahminical order is with the Brahmins at the top, and then you have the Kshatriyas or the warrior caste in between, and then you have the Vaishyas who are the traders as the third, and fourth are the Shudras, who were largely the peasants and artisans. Technically, in this fourfold system, the fifth, which is the untouchables, don't exist. But they are actually key to the survival of this whole system. So yeah, basically, when we look at a text like Arthashastra, that we see that, and we see that through the ages, that there was never any fusion of the kind you find of the church and the state in medieval Europe or Latin Christendom. It wasn't Europe then still. So what Charles Taylor would call Latin Christendom. That fusion is not even there in China, or in China is a very atheistic kind of culture in a certain sense, or if not atheistic, at least non-religious in a certain sense. But in India too, whether it is the earlier regimes, I'm not saying that it is all through irreligious. There are periods from the, let us say, the beginning of the common era till about the 11th and 12th centuries, when Brahminical power was established in India. That is the period when in different parts of the country we have an establishment through this of the Brahminical state or Brahminical conception of the state, which is thoroughly religious and so on and so forth. I mean, it is undergirded by a whole lot of religious Shastric understandings, and which is based on this fourfold, which is based on an enforcement of this fourfold order. So that I'll now not go into that in more detail. So the first part which I had dealt with, therefore, was the question of the political. How does this question of the political emerge in our context? The second question is the question of secularism, which is also another key artifact of modernity, political modernity. And where my contention again is that in the Indian context, the secular is actually, it only emerges in that sense in Europe in the context of the separation of the church and state, which, since it was not ever an issue here, the question of secular, in fact, never, throughout our anti-imperialist struggle, anti-colonial struggle, the word secular was never used except when the moment of constitution making came. That was when our constitution makers started looking at various constitutions across the world, the legal, so on and so forth. Otherwise, we had notions like unity and diversity, which was a kind of way of understanding co-living, coexistence of different communities like Islam and Hindus and so on. But it's interesting that this idea of unity in diversity actually draws from two very different traditions. At one level, you have the Vedantic Hindu tradition, which talks about the ultimate unity of the Brahman. Brahman is Brahma is at one level a kind of impersonal God, but at another level, the Brahman, the idea of the Brahman is the universe. So the ultimate unity of that universe, which manifests itself in many diverse forms, but at the end of it, it's one. Now, this is actually also very much, it resonates very much with Ibn al-Arabi's idea of Wahdatul Wujud, which is the unity of being. And in a sense, when our thinkers of the anti-imperialist tradition or the anti-colonial tradition started thinking about how to conceptualize this idea of coexistence, it was unity in diversity. It was concepts like these which drew from very different traditions and became the way through which Indian thinkers were trying to, Indian thinkers meaning those who were not really only thinking in completely derivative terms. So I would say to some extent people like Tagore and Gandhi, but people like Nehru. The term unity in diversity, I think, was Tagore's, but Nehru has used it a lot. So basically, that was the second. The third part has to do with the question of capitalism. Now, on that also, my argument in the book has been that we have kind of internalized the universal history of capital and the fact that it's and the understanding that it is something which is available. It's found all across the world. It is the first truly universal system which broke down all barriers and which is destined to break down all local barriers of economies and so on. But the fact of the matter is that capitalism, and that my argument is not just about India, my argument is that if we look at the entire debate around capitalism throughout the non-West, then from the 60s onwards, the debate that was going on about, first starting with the dependency debate or starting even before that with the structuralists of the ECLA under Raoul Prebisch, but later with the dependency debate, and then the Marxists entering the debate in different ways. But essentially, the anxiety throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the Marxist debate was that capitalism is really not developing in the way in which we expected it to, or Marx expected it to at any rate. So initial explanations of that were given in terms of Lenin's idea of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, which in a way obstructs the development, independent capitalist development in the colonies, and from where the idea of dependency then develops in a completely different direction. But my point is that actually this doesn't help understand the fact that even 200 years after capitalism and even 200 years after colonial rule tried to implant rule of private property in India or in different parts of the world, capitalism still remains unsuccessful in a certain way. Now, this is, if it were only me saying it, probably you might be, you might ask, but if you look at somebody like Hernando de Soto, who was drafted by the big neoliberal, who was drafted by various governments, including the Indian government at one point, to advise them on how they should go about with their economy. De Soto's book, which came out in 2013, one of his key books was called The Mystery of Capital, and why it develops why it succeeds in the West and fails everywhere else. That's the subtitle of the book. Now, De Soto is a completely convinced capitalist, and he wants capitalism to develop. And his point was that actually it does not develop because in most of the world, and this is based on the empirical work done by De Soto and his Institute of Liberty and Democracy, which is the Peruvian-based organization of his, where they discovered two things. One, that the rule of private property, that the rule of or the form of private property in most of the world, where in fact even in areas, so wherever they did their research, but even where in areas in countries where De Soto was advising governments, they could not actually specify the form that property took. Bourgeois property was not the real form. So in a way, he narrates the story of an Indonesian discussion with Indonesian government officials and so on. And he said that during the course of our research, we were going across, and we noticed that as we crossed the fields, this is in rural Indonesia, as we crossed the fields, a different dog would start barking. And so we knew that the dogs know where the boundary of one owner ends and the other begins. But really, the government does not know, and the people don't know, because there is no formal titling to property. Property exists more or less in the old way in which it existed, sometimes as usufruct, sometimes in other forms. Now, this has been the case despite 200 years of modernist regimes trying to institute the rule of private property in land and in agriculture, so on, without much success, still in many parts of the world. So from here, my point is that actually the understanding of capitalism that we have after Marx is something which we need to really think about, and think about through the lens of our non-Western, non-European experience. And so here, in my later book on Marxism, I have actually taken this, I've discussed this at much greater length. Here it is only a chapter, but the Marxism book actually discusses it in different ways throughout the book. So these are the three main key things around the key issues: the political, the secular, or secularism, and the and capital. But there is one more point, and I'll finish with that, that when we look at the West, non-West question, I think the question is complicated for us in India in another way. Because what many of these very sophisticated Indian intellectuals, including many Marxists, very important historians, for example, the way they dealt with it was basically that if there was a kind of assumption or presumption of a certain universalism, which any deviation from that, any reference to the specificity of the Indian situation, would be seen as some kind of reference to an indigenous Indian exceptionalism. And so the Marxists, and not just Marxists, but Marxist scholars, were very, very invested in trying to show that we were not different from. So if Europe had feudalism, we also had feudalism. If they had whatever they had, we had in a certain sense. But actually, and this is some of the current work that I'm doing, that actually, if you read through their work, there is this continuous difficulty in trying to find class struggle. You're trying to find the secular development of productive forces and so on and so forth, but you don't. And in a sense, when Marx talked about changelessness in Indian societies, or the village republics, or the self-sufficient village communities, or in fact, the later Marx, who was studying he spent most of his last 10 years studying the Russian peasant commune and the Russian agricultural systems, and also did a substantial amount of work in his, which is there in his ethnological notebooks, with substantial amount of work on India. Marx came to this conclusion towards the end of his life that there is no private property in many of these, what he earlier had called the Asiatic mode of production, that in many of these countries, there was no private property. There are different forms of common property, and there are different ways in which people have usufruct rights or other kinds of ways in which they live without necessarily demarcating who is the owner of, without actually demarcating who is the owner of that land. So as a result, the understanding of Marx, so the earlier Marx that we find, who still has some of these very typically Orientalist tropes borrowed from then current Orientalist theories about the changeless character of Indian society, about the self-sufficient village communities and so on. And it was correct on the part of Indian historians to critique that. But their critique, in fact, went in way beyond in completely disavowing the fact that there's any difference between the Indian social formation, or, I mean, they would at best say, okay, it's a kind of Indian variant of feudalism. Whereas actually what you have in India is, it's very difficult to call it feudalism. It's a completely different kind of formation, which I have discussed in the book. So I will end basically by saying that therefore, the question of decolonizing from the Indian context, decolonizing theory, decolonizing thought from the Indian context, becomes a much more complex task precisely because there are no simple divisions. At every level, we have to take every single formulation. We can't take anything at face value, because the same Marxist scholars who are actually critiquing Marx in a very correct way on some of the Orientalist tropes that Marx used, are also the people who are actually spending a lot of their time trying to find class struggle where they don't. And eventually, somebody as important as Irfan Habib, who's like, I think, one of the most towering medieval historians in India. So in one of his very important essays on the peasantry in India through history, peasant through Indian history, he says that actually, if you look at the material, you find that the peasants are actually never in, they're not contesting the owners, the landowners. What you find more often is the conflict between their exploiters. So it is between one section of the rural elite against another section of the rural elite, but it's not a class contradiction. It is a intra-elite contradiction, or if you use that term, feudal contradiction. So the point, therefore, is that so Irfan Habib himself, in fact, comes to recognize and comes to say this, but because it doesn't fit in with the theory, he also says that maybe this is because we do not have enough, or it is a problem with the kind of evidence we have. So that is the kind of difficulty we have to navigate and negotiate in the context of looking at the decolonizing question from the Indian vantage point. I specifically wanted to say this because some of these difficulties also happen. I remember last year, one of these right-wing theorists, thought him is actually a lawyer, but he's emerging as a kind of right-wing theorist. He wrote a book on some decolonizing thing, in which basically they're also arguing, and these people argue that a caste system was entirely created by the British, by colonialism and so on. So it's that kind of argument. But he managed to get a blurb by Walter Mignolo, because Mignolo didn't know what the Indian context was here. And then some friends wrote to him that, what have you done? I mean, what are you writing? So my point is that the complexity of the situation here is such that the neat binary between this is colonial and this is anti-colonial or this is decolonial is not something we can take for granted in the Indian context. And so I'll stop with this. Sorry, I hope I've not taken too much time.
Thank you very much, Aditya. It was really
Thank you.
great. Thank you very much for your brief and brilliant introduction. And now the ground is open for Mehdi, Majid, Michael, Muslim, Dustin. Please go on.
Yes. So, yeah, I'll turn off the video so that there's bandwidth issues are not there.
Do you,
Yes, we go on.
well, okay, I can, huh? Go ahead, say it. What? Are you talking to me? Say it.
Yes, go on. The ground is yours.
Justin, you don't want to say anything? Yeah.
You're good. Go ahead and go. I'm dealing with hardly able to talk and kids
Oh, okay.
in a protest
All
outside
right.
my door.
Well, I'll
So
cover for you. Yeah. I tell you, this the book. I started reading the book yesterday for the first time because I really, tell the truth, I forgot all about it because I've been so busy with different things. I think Dustin, I think all of us can relate to that when we say we're busy. But I read it, and I tell you, it's a good read. And congratulations, Aditya, you put a lot of work into it. Hopefully, it will continue to make headways into different areas, different corners of the world. And the material is fantastic, very deep. And I have, of course, several questions or several issues regarding some of the discussions when it comes to the whole notion of coloniality, colonialism. Let me just say from the get-go that I think you just pointed out that it is not as simple as it appears, because when we're talking about decolonization theory, somehow we're assuming a field that is universal and is similar, and they all have experienced the same thing and a lot of other things. But the reality of it, of course, is not the case. And therefore, when we talk about a decolonization theory, then we have to be careful. What is it that this theory is composed of? What's the conceptual framework? What are the concepts, operating concepts that we use in this theory to make a point? So in the case of India, obviously, it's going to be different than it is in the case of Latin America, as in the case of Africa. So in that sense, this whole decolonization theory, to me, it seems is a bit far-fetched. I don't know if the abstract concepts, of course, could be used universally, maybe at some point, but not, of course, everywhere, as we know. I decided that to look at some of the concepts that we're all familiar, because I'm not sure I know everything about this decolonization. I started talking about or thinking about decolonization, what appeared to me as multiculturalism appeared to me in the 1980s and 1990s. There was this explosion of multiculturalism literature in the U.S. Of course, multiculturalism itself goes back to the 1930s, and then, of course, it died down and then rose in the 1960s and 70s. But to me, it seems that there is this industry, this decolonization industries, this mushrooming, and they all talk about decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing this. But the sad reality of it is, it seems that very little knowledge exists, very little indigenous knowledge exists. In other words, there is really no ground to stand in order to oppose something. yes, colonization, of course, as a long history, has been around for centuries, and it has transformed different parts of the world. It has created a mindset that is not easily to get rid of. Um, and so this industry, of course, needs some sort of a self-policing, I think. I'm not going to say anything about the source of funding of the research that is taking place in the industry. And forgive me for calling it industry, because in reality, it is really an industry and is growing, and it has a source of fundings. Again, I don't know exactly what's the source is. I can see that the the direction, it seems, is not to create a world that can stand on its own, but it seems creating a world that can be co-opted into the dominant global system and the dominant narrative that exists. We can argue the same thing about, of course, social imperialism in advanced countries. That, you know, from the 1920s on, we've seen the rise of social imperialism, in which various opposition groups have been co-opted into the system, and all, of course, with the aid of academia and scholarly research. No need for the police and the surveillance. Of course, surveillance is always has been part of it. But as far as the attitude toward otherness, the otherness that it was created back in 19th century, maybe before that, describing non-Europeans, we've seen that binary continues. You know, today we talk about global north and global south. Global south itself appears to be a very degrading sort of concept, because when you talk about south, here in the States, we said the economy is headed south, which means is beginning to experience a lot of problems. The global south, the global north, and then of course it follows with that developed, underdeveloped, and then center, periphery, and and then of course the most important binary is the tradition, modernity. The tradition, modernity was the basis of really U.S. foreign policy, particularly with American sociology in the 1940s and 50s. The American sociology, which was wholeheartedly imported from Europe, continued with those two binaries of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, mechanical, organic, solidarity, tradition, modern, certainly, and civilized and uncivilized, and developed and underdeveloped and backward. And so we still continue with the same sort of attitude. We still use labels to define, to put people in certain boxes, certain categories, and then we'll go from there. Sadly, the scholarship within these so-called non-European societies continue also seem to consume the same set of terminologies without looking at the wealth of information, knowledge that exists within their own societies. Granted, there are societies that perhaps don't have that kind of knowledge, maybe because of the limited development, social development. But for the most part, we have a wealth of knowledge that we can use our own conceptual substitutes, in order to theorize and maybe to come up with concrete plan of action. One thing I noticed about the book, of course, was the idea that we don't have these binaries, but we have different modes of thinking. I thought that was beautiful. Different modes of thinking, different worldviews, different approaches to the world. The ontology, the sense of who we are, of course, however limited, but these are different modes of thinking that exist. And we really don't have a different mode of thinking that in many ways can can transcend modes of production. To me, Aditya uses the term mode of being as opposed to mode of production. Of course, I have an issue with that. Maybe he can describe that or explain that a little further. If capitalism is not a mode of production and colonialism is a vehicle by which capitalism expanded around the world, then in what way do we counter that? Can we use socialism and communism to counter colonialism, or it is as is the case, it's been argued repeatedly over and over, it is a certain dose of nationalism that is necessary. But then the question is, if we use nationalism to counter colonialism and imperialism, then where does it stop? Okay, where does it stop? I think the case of India today, I think, is an important to look at. So, and then one thing about Zizek, by the way, he mentions Zizek and others. There is certainly a this is a continuation of the classical European thinking, particularly from the Enlightenment onwards. That whole notion of otherness that emerged from the post-colonial period. Today, we see that we can see that this contemporary consumption of this as what I call Western blurb has extended into the rest of the world. Today, I know people in different parts of the world who, when they speak, in order to get affirmation, they have to quote somebody from the West, like, you know, Heidegger and Foucault, Habermas, etc., 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 which is fine. But then again, what does that imply? Does that mean that they don't have anything? We don't have anything of our own to perhaps to make a solid argument that we have to rely on Western social science and philosophical worldview, or is it that we really don't have the knowledge of it? I think the latter is the case. I think that we don't have enough information. One of the things, by the way, that I think in our own world, in addition to Iqbal that Aditya mentions, like or Tagore in India, and but we also have in the Middle East quite a few of these, you know, giant thinkers that have actually given us ways of looking at the world and maybe come up with a way of theorizing about ourselves instead of constantly consuming the packaged material that is produced elsewhere. And by the way, speaking of package, I really consider Zizek to be a package that is thrown in the mess, and that's for a purpose. If anybody thinks that Zizek has somehow emerged out of nowhere and then, you know, individually, think again, because there is a trace, you can see clearly that these are all by design. Yuval Harari, for instance, goes around, the guy who, by the way, said that if we have to nuke Gaza in order for Israel to survive, we should do it. It's in the same line, really. These are imperial bullhorns out there. But then the sad part of it is that they are being consumed by the outside of European social world. They're beginning to influence the line of thinking that exists in non-Western world. So I think that as long as there is really no pride in based on what we know, what we have, then we're going to have this lingering inferiority complex. And in addition to this, when there is inferiority complex, of course, we become susceptible to all sorts of abuses. There is this sort of a low self-esteem that is not really that is not our own creation, but is something that we've constantly been invited to think of ourselves as someone with low esteem. We have difficulty thinking our own self-worth. And because of that, of course, we have never been able to challenge the narratives, the dominant narratives that exist, of course, coming from the West. there is a sense of self-loathing I can see. And by self-loathing, I mean, I can see the attack on our own intellectuals. We tend to trash what is really has the promise of maybe helping us understand the reality better. I can see in the case of Iran, for instance, Iranians, particularly after the Iranian Revolution, we've seen this division that exists, and not that many people are really even thinking about perhaps that reading the text, maybe that we could address some of the issues on our own without relying on outside sources. So how do we stop this lingering lingering low self-esteem that we're experiencing? And there is incredible amount of knowledge that is produced, but then again, it's not really systematic. It's not organized. We tend to denigrate each other's work in most cases. And now, of course, we have a new generation of imperial ideologues, and some of them are decolonization theorists, decoloniality theorists, that really they're not helping much, but also they're creating a sense of pity sort of existence, and then adding to that sort of inferiority complex. Excuse me for saying inferiority complex, but the reality of it is there's really no other name for it. When we're experiencing or measuring ourselves, it seems is always the standard is the West, because we really don't have.
You have 1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, sorry about that. Sorry for rambling, but there are just so many things in this book that I hope that maybe when we have time to ask questions, we can. And my notes are very unorganized. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Michael, Dustin, Muslim. Yes, go on.
Thank you, Seyed. I mean, a lot of what Mehdi said, I could agree with. In terms of the actual book, I mean, my own kind of, I suppose, journey with thinking about colonialism, decoloniality, decolonization theory is, I mean, it's still ongoing. I mean, we've got this idea to have a conference for the Institute for Critical Social Theory next year. It's going to happen in Bristol. And we're speaking about that conference will very likely take it will be around these kind of issues. And so, I was really excited to be here today, and I got so much from the book. There's much of it which I can use. I mean, as some of you already know, I mean, I want to start thinking about these issues as they relate to Ireland and its relationship with the English Empire or English colonialism, and then later on with British colonialism. And I see lots of parallels with what Aditya was saying in his book, and some of the concepts I found really, really useful, which I think really do apply. But I also couldn't help thinking that it jumps off the page to me that it really fits with what the work you've been doing, Seyed, on intercivilizational dialogue. It's this question around whether or not these so-called kind of what you call the canon of Western philosophy or whatever can actually just be, wholesale just applied to different parts of the world to try to make sense of that lived experience there and the forms of sociality and oppression that they've experienced. One of the things that it just kept like prodding me all the time was this idea about, and it's something that some of you have said before, I've never really seen it as a problem. But in the book, it's somehow, I started to think of it as problematic, partly because I've done a little bit more research on Ireland. My parents are both Irish. I consider myself to be Irish. but I've been born and brought up in England. And I wasn't brought up to know about Irish history. My parents were not that way inclined. My father was a forklift truck driver. My mother was a factory cleaner and an office cleaner. And they both left school at 10 years old. So I always say about my parents, they were really intelligent. They had a native intelligence about them, but they were ignorant in terms of education and their own culture. And as they got older and they learned more and more, we had some of those conversations, but not much. And we certainly didn't learn about colonialism in Ireland within our family. And what's really kind of prompted me to start to think about these issues is debates around decoloniality within the university that I work in. And so I go along to a meeting and scholars are talking about decoloniality. We're given a paper to read. It was an Indian scholar and we discussed it. And all the conversation is about black and brown people, as they call themselves now in the UK. They refer to themselves as I'm a brown person, I'm a black person. And decoloniality as an industry and decolonization as an industry. I never thought about that until Mehdi said it. But it's absolutely what I see in Britain, where it's not about trying to challenge the legacy of colonialism and the forms of knowledge and discourse around that make people kind of think in certain ways, feel certain things, act in certain ways. It's about certain people using this platform to actually promote themselves, to actually get on themselves within this existing, Western situation. And when they were having the debate, I said, it's really interesting that nobody's talked about the Irish yet, and I don't really know much about it because I've only just started thinking about it. But, you can't just restrict it to colour, because that in itself is a form of racism when you exclude the first ever British colony or English colony. And Ireland was suppressed and oppressed for 800 years by England and Britain. And some of the things I've been learning recently are just very, very little things about language and how, and Aditya was talking about that in his book, how you can kind of have an influence on vocabulary or language, and that determines how we interact with each other, how we communicate with each other, and how we think. And it was all tied up with the English Reformation in the 1500s, which really put an extra element to the oppression of Ireland by England, because Ireland was Catholic and England was Protestant. And I think just to kind of call it Christendom, I think is problematic. I think you've got to separate those two things out, and you've got to see the context, the kind of history of colonialism in Ireland from England in the context of Catholicism and Protestantism. I don't think you can just lump that together. And I don't think you can just simply say Western and the rest. Often in these conversations, people say things like the West and the rest, Western societies and Western societies. But what I've been learning so far is I don't think you can lump Ireland in and just simply say that it is part of some European Western bloc which is trying to impose itself on other parts of the world. Any colonialism that came from Britain was not coming from Ireland. And so I think that to simply say, we've got all these different cultures and we need to be kind of cognizant that, as Mehdi was saying, Latin America or Africa, different countries in Africa will experience it differently. Different countries around the world will experience it differently. And we've all got this commonality. But these countries which have been assigned as Western, this is unproblematical. They're part of the colonizers on the rest of the brown and black people of the world. I find that quite problematical to the project that I'm trying to do. And I don't know much much Gaelic. I don't know much Irish language. I'm actually looking on my screen. It just keeps being Seyed Javad. I'm looking at Seyed Javad. I think he knows 8 or 9 languages. I think he's actually published in about 6 languages. I don't know. I don't know much about language, and I've been trying to learn some Gaelic as part of my research. And I'm going to say these words wrong. And if anybody's Irish and they speak Gaelic and they watch this, they'll call me an Egypt or something like that. They'll say all things about me. But I think to say hello in Irish, in Gaelic, it's Chia Gwit. And that means God to you, not God be with you, God to you. And the answer back was Gia is Mura Gwit. And that means God and Mary to you. So the way in which Irish people greeted each other in Gaelic, which is only 2% of Ireland now, was to say God to you and God and Mary to you. And then that gets reduced to hello. And then someone says hello back. And this to me has a major impact, a major influence on consciousness, on your cultural sense of your own identity, of your religiosity, of your spirituality. And as an Irish person who's been brought up in England, I know that my experience is very different to English people in England, but it's also very different to Irish people in Ireland. And it's a place steeped in mysticism, spirituality, belief, in a way that Aditya talks about India. Ireland is not to be seen as just part of Europe, which is secular and just part of the West unproblematically. So I think I see a lot of parallels with India in terms of the analyses that Aditya wrote in his book. And I also think it's really interesting, the other things that connect Ireland and India. And so when Ireland was trying to get independence, Churchill is alleged to have said, we must throw everything we've got at the Irish, because the Irish cannot get their independence, because if it does, we will lose the jewel in the crown. And the jewel in the crown was, of course, India. And so the atrocities that were visited upon Ireland and Irish people to prevent a domino effect of other nations wanting to, kick out their colonial masters. I think that Ireland bore the brunt of that. And I think a lot of what Ireland did actually helped other nations to get their so-called independence too. But it's not a competition, and it shouldn't be a competition. But I think if we're going to have a conversation about these different phenomenon, colonialism, decoloniality, decolonialization and stuff, I think it has to be inclusive if we're going to study it. But in terms of the practice of trying to move beyond a society, a mode of thinking, beyond the one that's actually been established by the colonial masters, that's always going to have to be done on the ground in that particular locality. I don't think we can have an overriding universal theory as such for all these different places. But what we can is we can learn from theories, and we can try to see to what extent these theories might be helpful. And I think we also, final point I'd make, because I've really, obviously really stimulated my thoughts. I also think that, yeah, it's true that we can't just take Karl Marx and apply Karl Marx to the Indian experience or whatever, or the Irish experience. But I think at the same time, you might be able to use theorists from some of these, from theorists who are theorizing about colonialism and trying to get past the kind of legacies and hangovers of that. And so when I was reading this book by Mehdi and Seyed, I mean, there's something here which I thought was really helpful also for my thinking about the extent to which colonialism, the kind of colonialism that Shariati was talking about, Ali Shariati, I think that's also helpful more broadly, not just relating to Iran. And so the quote was, the root of the corrupted identity and cultural ignorance, and he was talking about Iran, is as much a product of the external forces as it is of internal forces. The corrupt identity is further corrupted by the dialectic of Sordell, the behavior of groups and nationalities who take pride in their connection in a subservient fashion to the colonial godmother. So I think when Shariati is talking about something very, very specific there, he's talking about his critique of colonialism as experienced by what's now called Iran. But I can see some value in that to my own thinking about how people in Ireland, they took on these new subjectivities, these new ways of being, these new modes of thinking that actually fitted in with the kind of the new forms of society that they were that were being shaped. And I think that there is these kind of concept theories that we can learn from and may be applicable the other way around more than they are in terms of this Western canon of sociology, philosophy, or whatever, trying to make sense of the experience of people in these oppressed places. It's an ongoing project, guys, and I'm really want to hear what other people have to say. And I turned my camera off, Mehdi, when you were speaking a bit, because I was taking notes about what you were saying.
Oh, well, I hope
yeah.
that I made some sense because there's so much to say though. I was just, I almost was overwhelmed, because all the stuff and then it's short amount of time.
And in Aditya's book, I mean, I've got a PDF of the book that Sage shared. And I started to kind of highlight bits that I thought were really interesting. And I wouldn't be able to share the book with you because I'd be embarrassed because now the entire book is highlighted in yellow.
Mm-hmm. What was the book you were referring to? What's the title of that book you referred to?
Aditya's book?
No, the other one.
You actually showed another one.
That brilliant piece of work.
Can you read out the title? It's too small to read. Yeah.
This is a book which is Introduction to the Emancipatory Social Philosophy of Ali Shariati.
Oh, I see.
Within Islam and the Promise of Emancipation by Mehdi Shariati, who is the nephew of Ali Shariati, and Seyed Javad Miri, who organized this event with Dustin.
I see. Okay.
Who's the publisher?
Yeah.
The publisher is Ekporosis Press, which means from the roots. So this is all about publishing works which are fundamentally about emancipation, justice, and truth.
Exactly.
I should get hold of, yes, I should get hold of it.
I can send you a link.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think in terms of building a bridge really between Iran, India, and even Latin America, I can see the concepts that we develop, or what we talked about, concepts that have already been developed, we brought included in the book. That I think really are capable of building a bridge, and I think we're speaking from the same platform, really. I think. So, anyways.
Yeah, so I guess I could probably say a few words if that's okay. I like I said before, I've had an upper respiratory infection for the last week, so I can't talk very long, otherwise I'll start a coughing fit. but I can get in a few comments I would like to make here before we send it back to Aditya, unless the Seyed Javad needs to chime in. And that is something what Michael was talking about with the Irish. I think it's always important to remember as well that, you know, oftentimes the victims of colonization can become the next victimizers of colonization. You know, so many of the Irish that were starved out of existence in many ways by the British who came to North America, many of them within a generation or two became some of the worst abusers of native peoples, of African peoples here, just for the simple fact that, you know, they were nothing in the empire, the British Empire. They were the scum of the earth. They could be eradicated, but when they came here, all of a sudden they had a sense of power because, you know, they weren't Irish anymore. They were white Americans, and as white Americans, they had people underneath them. And so the lessons of colonization and the brutality of colonization was then utilized upon the lesser peoples in the Americas. And that's one of the most barbaric ramifications of colonization, is that those who are colonized learn the lessons of colonization and can then mete it out to other people, unfortunately. The other thing I'd like to say is about decolonization as an industry. You know, I'm in the publishing industry as well, and it is certainly the case that there is a marketing trend right now in decolonization, that if you're writing a book that can be brought under the auspices of decolonization theory, you're going to have publishers who are interested in it, because right now it's a hot topic. For them, it's a selling topic. It's a topic that's selling a lot of books. I mean, obviously, it's capitalism. They couldn't care less. They'll you know, they'll sell you the rope to hang you, you know, if you or to hang them, you know, if they think they can make $1 out of it. So I think, you know, what we really have to think about as decolonization scholars, or people who are thinking about this, is how that we pursue it, but we also protect not the quality of our work. That's not really the point, but the integrity of it. That it really is an attempt to push the not just the thinking about decolonization theory, but also the praxis. How do we translate this type of stuff into real legitimate movement, so it doesn't just become a fad? You know, I think of when Herbert Marcuse back in the 1960s made it to the cover of Time magazine. And he basically, when he was asked, you know, what does he feel about that? He said, well, now I know I'm completely irrelevant because I can somehow be brought into the mainstream.
Yeah.
And so I'm no longer subversive, you know what I mean? I've lost all my social power, you know, by being on Time magazine. So we have to always be aware that, I think, you know, of the potential of sort of emasculating the entire theory by allowing it to become too standardized, too normal, too just academic. But really, we have to connect it with praxis as much as we can. And then the last thing, part of what, you know, Ikpharosis Press is doing is trying to understand the West from the West's own resources, but in translation, or excuse me, in conversation with countries, cultures, religions that are non-Western, if you will, if that even makes any sense anymore. And so when we look at decolonization theory, one of the things that I've been looking and watching and examining for years now is how decolonization theory is now starting to be used by the far right, especially in North America, in the European ethnospheres, they would call it, you know, by saying that with the massive immigration that you have, especially since in Europe since 2014, with the refugee crisis from Syria and Iraq and in other places in the Middle East, that somehow Europe itself is being colonized. It's the new subject of colonization. And therefore, the language of decolonization, the arguments that we're creating, are in many ways being turned on us. You know, so if we're looking for a more diverse society, a society that's more universal, that we come to love each other and all of our differences and truly cherish them, not just, you know, like them, because we're supposed to, but truly cherish the differences, the beauty of all of our differences, that is being turned against us, right? By saying that somehow, Indians, they might be in England, but they're not really English. The Turks of Germany aren't really Turks. The Moroccans of the Netherlands aren't really Moroccan. They have a different Geist, a different spirit. They might be citizens on paper, but they're not legacy citizens, so they're not really of us. And what the far right wants to do is decolonize the West of the former colonial subjects who have come to the metropoles, following, we're talking about capitalism, following the surplus value that was stolen from their countries, right? So now they're coming back to the metropoles. And so decolonization theory in many ways can be perverted, I think, for racist ends, xenophobic ends. So we always have to be very leery of that as well. So with that, I will rest my voice and we can move on.
I mean, the only thing I'd say, I think that was, you're absolutely right, Dustin. But the kind of research I've done so far was that when Irish immigrants went into America, I think in between 1845 and about 1855, there was about 1.5 million Irish people went to America because of the potato famine. And when they first arrived there, they were not seen as white. They were not
Right.
seen as white like other Americans. And the literature I've read so far said that Irish people had to earn their whiteness. And they were referred to as Negroes turned inside out. And there was, I think when we look at how, so to say that Irish people went to America and became, part of the problem of colonization or prejudice or discrimination or oppression or abuses of power or whatever, I think that it's not to defend that. It's to try to think about what is the context for that. Why did they become like that? These people who had experienced these atrocities and were trying to kind of just survive and live. Why did they end up becoming, some of the worst oppressors against Black people in the United States in the years after? And maybe they were made to be like that by the circumstances that they had, because there was a kind of unity between Black people and Irish people when the Irish went to, I think, predominantly Boston. But once the Irish started to get a foothold, they in fact did indeed try to keep Black people back from progressing the way they had done. And so, that whole thing, to kind of, and I'm not saying you're doing this because I don't know enough about it yet, but just my thought is that without me having to do a lot more research and thinking a lot more about it, to kind of say that somehow Irish people are just unproblematically involved in forms of colonization and oppression, I think it misses the context within which people make that choice to be like that and to do those things. But I think the similar argument can be made about, chattel slavery, North Atlantic slave trades. Black people were kidnapping Black people and selling them to white people to be slaves. So I think it is true that some of the people who've been treated in these barbaric, inhuman, degrading ways themselves can actually start acting in those ways. I think there's a lot more to it. I'm defending my Irish brothers and sisters, I think.
You're good. I'm with you with the defending the Irish brother.
I didn't know how to finish, so I just said that.
No, I'm with you on that. Yeah, no, my point isn't that there's something with the Irish that they got here. It's that there was a system in place there that once you were here, yeah, you were Irish for a couple generations at best, and then you became just white. And like you said, the Irish had to earn that whiteness. And one of the ways in which they did it, and many other different peoples did it, was by simply absorbing that racist system and becoming part of it. And unfortunately, that's how you became quote unquote white here.
I mean, some of you know that you know I spend pretty much every day of my life, and I have done for almost over 20 years now, working on alleged wrongful conviction cases. And you know, if anybody knows anything about miscarriage of justice cases, innocent people being wrongly convicted, as it applies to the UK, people know about the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4 and cases like that. And I know some of the people in those cases. They now become friends of mine. But when I first started looking at these wrongful convictions, I mean, those cases were overturned in 1989, the Guildford 4, 1993, the Birmingham 6. When I started looking at miscarriage of justice, studying it properly in the late 90s, I didn't even problematize these injustices as being because these people were Irish. Because, and I think the reason for that, I'm starting to think, is because in Britain, the way in which the way in which inverted commas, you know, discussions around inverted commas, race and racism, there is racism, there's no such thing as race. But the way in which those, the public conversation about that, the public debate, political debates about that, it was always about the Windrush generation, black people coming into Britain in the 1950s, and the kind of diaspora of Indian and Pakistani people coming into Britain. And it was always around colour. There was never any conversation about Irish people. And what happened was they were always lumped in with the white working class. And so I was brought up by Irish people in an Irish community with lots and lots of Irish people. And we knew these people were Irish, and there was something about that, but we really just thought it was to do with injustice generally, because we'd all experienced this kind of thing growing up. So even though I was living in England, we were living in an Irish community, we were Irish people, we were Fenians, we were policed in that way, and we were criticised in that way. And it was just normal for us. So we didn't even problematize it like it was something to do with being Irish. And it wasn't until I became an academic and I met Paddy Hilliard, and he'd written a book about suspect community. And I started to reflect upon, you know, how I was treated as a child, how we were policed in our area where we lived, and how, you know, even when I was growing up, I was like refused a job in Rolls-Royce, even though I passed the entrance exam to be an apprentice engineer. And they told me in the interview that I had the apprenticeship. So I told my parents, and they were really happy that their son was going to be a tradesman, he was going to be a skilled engineer. And then 2 weeks later, the offer was retracted because they'd found out on the form that it said parents' nationality, I put Irish, and then they took the offer back because Rolls-Royce at that time was a national industry. And in the 1970s, Irish people could not work for British national industries because they thought that I might be a sleeper or something like that, a kind of a potential IRA terrorist. But we didn't really problematize things in terms of colonialism and things like that. So my interest now, and like I said, it isn't a competition, and the brutalities that other peoples have experienced because of, you know, colonialism, not just British colonialism, but other nations' colonialism as well. It's not a competition, but I think that these peoples who have experienced colonialism need to study it. Like, you know, we hear a lot in the UK about black people are not taught their history. Well, Irish people aren't taught their history either. And other peoples in Britain are not taught their histories either, because it upsets the apple cart when we start to learn about our past and our culture and our heritage, etc. Yeah, I'll stop now. Sorry, Dustin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, great. I have just few small maybe words to say. First of all, I want to congratulate Aditya for this wonderful work. I read it, I really enjoyed it, and I learned. And this is not something I'm just like as a complimentary note. I really learned. First of all, I tell you, when I was reading the book, I came across many, many names, especially like thinkers, social theorists I have never heard. And I started to make note of them, each one of them. And I started to Google about them. And I started to actually find the different books. For example, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And the concept he used, decolonization of mind. And then others like Sudipta Kaviraj, who talked about, or maybe one of his main concepts, ontological depletion. In this book, you come across many, many interesting concepts. And through these concepts, I could actually reconceptualize what I have been trying for many years to say, but I didn't have the concepts. And I think one of the most interesting part of the book, everybody, I think they had very different and beautiful words to say, but I think, at least as far as I understand, the focus of the book is not only decolonizing theory, it is the subtitle, thinking across traditions. And that was the point actually, you know, one of the main, maybe one of the major concepts of, we may say, for example, Eurocentrism, in Kantian terms, is the concept of subject or sujet, as French say. But then how can we overcome this concept? Not only say, for example, overcome Western or Eastern, no. How can we relate to reality through a different way, not through subjectivism? And it is in Nagarjuna's idea where actually Aditya brings a very important concept of Nagarjuna. And he explains, he says like this, I quote, unfortunately, I have the PDF, so in the PDF, I couldn't have the page numbers. Sorry. Yeah. It says, Aditya says, in my discussion of Nagarjuna's idea of emptiness and dependent arising, I have tried to indicate that from that point of view, the category of a structure or a totality is itself problematic. If the idea of dependent arising is essentially one that understands being itself as empty or anatta or non-self, as an effect of a contingent encounter between different elements and constellations, then the concept of a structure will prove to be simply unworkable. And if we want to try to overcome Eurocentrism on one of the most important concepts, which is subject or the idea of subjectivism, then we have to encounter the idea at a level of ontology. But how can we find a concept which could overcome subjectivism as an ontological concept? Then, when you come, or when you are able to think across traditions, intellectual traditions, then you can start thinking about, oh, if I am saying, for example, Eurocentrism is based on binary oppositions. So saying that, but just repeating and not being able to step forward, it will not help us. This is where actually Aditya, in the beginning of the book, says very, very interesting point. And he says, the constraint of post-colonial theory was that they were actually pinpointing to important issues, but because they were thinking through Eurocentric categories and concepts, they couldn't overcome Eurocentrism. But in order to be able to overcome, then you have to be able to read and go beyond what he says very interestingly. And this is another concept which I learned from Aditya is yes, how to overcome the autobiographical narrative of Western modernity. These are very interesting concepts, and I think this is one of the books which when I was reading, in each page, I could find very important insight and concept. Once again, I want to congratulate Aditya and thank you for writing this book, and hoping you will write more and we will learn more about all these issues. Thank you very much, Aditya. Namaste.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
And one more thing, Aditya, when I was reading the part you were talking about the Muslim intellectual tradition, I was saying, wow, he's saying things I have even never heard of it. And I started to actually reread the Muslim intellectual tradition, the eruditism and the literary involvement with different parts of the world in this book is really amazing. It's a gigantic project you have undertaken. I congratulate you.
Thank you, Javad. Can I just say a few words by way of response? I won't respond to everything, but there is also a question which one of the Murshid Alam has asked on the chat, and plus some of the issues raised by Mehdi, Dustin, and Michael also. So I thank you very much, Javad, of course, for the very encouraging and positive response from your side. But I just want to now say something. So first, Murshid's question, which is that on the chat, how do we go beyond colonialism, beyond condemnation of colonialism? I think that is, I try to kind of indicate some ways in the book, which is of epistemic reconstitution. The book is not a condemnation of colonialism only. It is, of course, a condemnation, but it is an attempt, I think, as Javad, you rightly, I think, caught on to the argument, to think across traditions, to think not only across the West and East or Western India, but something which as an aspiration remains with me in terms of thinking from, let us say, thinking in terms of the East Asian traditions, Chinese, Japanese, and so on, because I've actually only access through translation through to Chinese and Japanese, but that's how we read Marx also, or Foucault also. Everything is in translation. So I'm not particularly apologetic about that. I'm not saying that unless we get it in the original, we'll not read it. And we've read everything in translation, so I don't have a problem with that. But I think the key thing is to think in terms of the resources for alternative theorization. So the kind of things that you were mentioning, Javad, I think those are small efforts or small steps in that direction that actually in the course of, for example, in the course of thinking about capital, how do I think about it without thinking of it as a totality or as a structure, as a closed structure? When I'm thinking about it in terms of the various other parts of the world. So Murshid, I would say that if you read the book, the first chapter, which is on In Conversation with Sudipta Kaviraj's revisionist theory of modernity, itself, I think, is an attempt to go beyond mere condemnation. I'm not simply condemning. That work is done already by post-colonial theory. What we are doing now is taking post-colonial theory as our starting point, or post-colonial studies as our starting point, but trying to look at what are the ways in which theorizing has been done or is possible. One of the problems, and here I would actually come to the points raised by Mehdi Shariati in the beginning, I understand entirely that this industry. In fact, I think Dustin put it absolutely spot on. It was absolutely spot on. For capitalism, everything is an industry. So it really doesn't surprise me when postmodernism comes, it is an industry. Even Marxism became an industry at one point. So Marxism, which came as an opponent of capitalism, became an industry. So I'm not particularly surprised by the fact that decolonization and decolonial theory has also become an industry now. But I think the point that you raised uh, about how capitalism, colonialism, etc., if these are considered as modes of being and related to a particular mode of being, what is our response to it? I think neither socialism nor nationalism. Nationalism was one kind of response which actually simply looked at it in binary terms as their nationalism and our national, the imperialist nationalism or colonizing nationalism versus the nationalism of the colonized. Socialism tried to get beyond that, but I think socialism is also in a way limited in the sense, I think the spirit of socialism I still hold by. But I think what we need to think of from our traditions, and that is where the question of thinking across traditions comes in, that when I look at, for example, current struggles against capitalism and so on and so forth, the key points of struggle are the indigenous people struggles and the kind of theoretical formulations that are coming out, for example, from Africa, Ubuntu, or the Sumo Kosak from Latin America, are actually drawing from certain indigenous worldviews, indigenous people's worldviews, to present, or even Buddhism in certain cases, which are trying to present an ontological challenge to the possessive individualism of bourgeois modernity, so that we can think, can we actually think of an individual, precisely the point that Javad made, that it's an ontological question. How do we conceptualize this move beyond capital or capitalism and colonialism? That is where I think we need to move beyond that self-aggrandizing possessive individual to a notion of a situated self, which is where what Ubuntu or Sumo Kosak, etc., are trying to articulate. So I think at one level, that is my point on that. Michael's questions, actually, I'm quite struck by the whole, not questions. I think I take most of your things as comments from which I do concede that I have actually not that much familiarity with the Irish situation, although a lot of Irish freedom struggle, Irish people had a lot of connection with the Indian freedom struggle also. And so we have some kind of relationship with that. But I would say one thing, which is that or rather two points which you raised. I just want to, I'm not responding to them, but I'm just kind of giving if I may say so, a kind of
remarks.
Yeah, it's more a kind of speaking to the kind of concern you raised. The first, by way of clarification, when I use the term Latin Christendom, I did not mean that all Christian. This is a term Charles Taylor uses because pre-modern Europe is actually not Europe yet. It is just one big formation, which he calls Latin Christendom. And we have then the formations separating out into different denominations and so on. And there, obviously one has to make a distinction between a society like Ireland, which is a colonized society in Europe or in Britain, Britain's colony in Europe, and the colonizing powers like Britain and France and Spain. So I entirely agree with that. I agree with you also. I didn't think of it like that, but when you were talking about the question of spirituality and how you talk about hello and the Irish versions in which you talk about, you say hello and respond to a hello. I think it's a bit like salam alaikum and wa alaikum salam. In a certain sense, that it is not a pure hello, 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 which is a purely secular hello, hello. But what you're actually saying has deeper spiritual connections there, and that perhaps has to also be thought as kind of our daily practices of living. So I think that one of the reasons why in the secularism chapter I spent a lot of time on the question of spiritualism and the specifically Indian Puranic, what I call the Puranic mode, has to do with this, that these are modes of being about which we have very little as secular intellectuals, we have very little access to. And our access to them is more, in that sense, colonially mediated, in the sense that it is mediated by a certain way of how the modern colonial sees these kind of spiritual ways of being. So yes, I think that was it. And yes, of course, one point which Dustin's that the decolonization theory being used by the far right, racist, xenophobic, and how you use the essentialized notions of how, despite being in Europe, you still remain a Turkish or an Iranian or a Pakistani or an Indian and so on. I think it's a very, very important question, but this is one question which actually I felt even when reading long back Naughton Negri's Empire, where they kind of, I think there is a problem in the way in which they also dealt with this whole question of identity and fundamentalism. I think part of the decolonizing move has to be to destabilize these. If I were to actually refer to Mahmoud Mamdani's work on South Africa, for example, or Africa in general, I think that would probably make the point you're making, make that more easily understandable. That all across South Africa during the apartheid regime, actually, and other parts of Africa, what was presented as the custom was actually what was instituted by the colonial power, and they froze certain kinds of tribal identities in opposition to the white oppressors, who were the whites and the colonizers. And so the colonizers had actually not much distinction. But when it came to Africans, the tribe was kind of not only valorized, but it was reified into a structure which became then the demarcating point of the homelands and the Bantustans. And so I think what Mahmoud Mamdani's work, and more recently his Neither Native Nor Settler, in a way argues, is that decolonizing the political requires, the first precondition of decolonizing the political is to recognize that the creation of permanent minorities, this is Mahmoud Mamdani, this is not my words, that the creation of permanent minorities has been globally part of the colonial project. In a way, the freezing of identity and creating permanent minorities has been crucial to the way in which political modernity has taken place, has instituted itself under colonial regimes. So I think that perhaps may give us a way out of this far right appropriation question, and how to think of identities as more fluid and not frozen in colonial in ways in which colonial governmentality froze it. So yeah, that's
Um,
Thank you very much, Aditya.
I think. Thanks. I think Mehdi.
Yeah,
just
maybe.
one comment. Yeah. You know, you're well familiar with the dominant logical imperialism or empiricism or positivism. The reality is, you know, that science decides everything. Science sets the tone for everybody. Science defines everything. Science decides what's worth, what's not worth. Scientific knowledge is the best knowledge. And so now we have someone like Elon Musk, when he doesn't even say anything, he has said something. Obviously, these are the people who set the tone for everybody around the world. So the question, how do we transcend that? Can we talk about identity and, you know, empowerment of what the Europe calls the other, right? The other, whether it's internal by way of, you know, ethnic minorities in this country, for instance, or beyond the European territorial area. What is it that can be done if we cannot really develop that that powerful cosmopolitan commodities that can crush the Chinese wall, to paraphrase Marx? What is it?
Suddenly your voice has gone off.
Oh, my voice is gone off?
Now it's come. Now it's come.
Oh, sorry. Missed a good part then. Yeah.
No. Just one sentence, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that given this dominant mode of thinking and view on the world, you know, empiricism, you know, that the power of the machine, whoever makes it, therefore, and you can look at the certain areas in which they have managed to master the machine or control the machine and produce commodities that they are looked upon differently than those who have not, obviously. In fact, we measure development based on our ability to deal with the machine, right? And the productive capacity, how we can transform input into outputs and in whatever level. But the fact of the matter is that our thinking, therefore, is a reflection of what we see around the world. So if the European always feels superior to the rest, it's precisely because of that. There is nothing else. Of course, that has been reinforced by philosophical, social, you know, metaphysical arguments always, you know, and but what should be the source of empowerment, I guess? I mean, India is on the right path in terms of industrial development. Yet on the other hand, we see the uneven development that it seems to be going on forever and ever, uneven development, you know. Dependency theorists try to overcome that by, like you mentioned, it was interesting to see import substitution, industrialization, and proposed by prohibition, you know, maybe export substitution, industrialization, but what I call defensive capitalist development, actually, the four tigers, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, that developed themselves because they were defined, given by the global division of labor. They took the responsibility of becoming export processing zones. Then, of course, later other countries decided to do. I don't know why the Shah of Iran, for instance, failed to even consider that. They could easily get a lot of benefits from having a 1,200-mile border with Soviet Union during the Cold War. He could have asked for anything. He would have received it from the West. to develop that economy. My point is that the part of the global system, of course, we have to look at all of these factors, but the fact remains that to empower people who are right now powerless in the global system, that we try to decolonize. What should be the basis of that? I can talk about mysticism of the East, but that really doesn't jive well.
No. I think that is a construct again, part of the Orientalist thing.
Right.
I mean, obviously, a country like India, which has been like so thoroughly presented as a mystical, spiritual, whatever.
Yeah.
I can tell you, this was not what was happening all through. I mean, there was mathematics, there was astronomy, there was the decimal system and the zero discovered. Then through Al-Khwarizmi, it becomes the Roman, the Arabic numeral and so on. Al-Khwarizmi develops it, calculus develops. It was not just that we were doing only spirituality. So I think that is true of all the East. This was an Orientalist construction which we have to get out of. I mean, I think every society in the East has had very strong materialist traditions. Without that, people can't live. And people actually are not only doing spirituality. That's one part of it. So I don't know, but this is a collective search, and I think all of us have to put our heads together on it. So I guess
what I'm saying in terms of thinking about decolonization, because often people think in terms of official colonization. Well, that has ended. It's gone. But colonization certainly exists in all respects, no question. But the question is, I think we should think about empowerment instead of decolonization. Empower. What's missing really on the other side is empowering or the power to decide for itself, and then go from there. And then then industrial development, social development, economic development in any form will follow. But I think that empowerment.
Sure.
I think this is the title of our joint next book. Empowerment.
Yes. Empowerment. By the way, when talk about colonization, history of it, let me just point out something that Ali Shariati mentioned. He considered Muhammad to be a revolutionary to try to decolonize Islam. It's interesting. Muhammad was a revolutionary that tried to decolonize Islam. But Islam, remember, was not invented by Muhammad. Islam was a name that was given to the Ummah people by Abraham. That Abraham called us Muslims, in other words, according to the Quran. So Abraham decolonizes, right? Removes the structure of Cain, or at least tries, right? The structure of Cain by getting rid of all the gods, and asking people to follow one God, monotheism. Then, of course, Moses, and then Jesus and Muhammad. But after Muhammad's death, what happens? Again, it goes back to the original. Then, of course, the colonizers come in, okay, and take control. In fact, they murder the grandson of Prophet Muhammad, Hussein, in order to continue with that colonization process. So I'm saying that it seems that even things like mundane religious, narratives, still we can look at it globally and say that, yes, this is part of the process of emancipation. Let's read the text. Let's pay attention closely. Let's analyze it. Don't be so judgmental and dismissive just because it doesn't correspond to your logical, empirical, positivistic crap. But, okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If no questions, then we can conclude our session. And I thank you, all the contributors, and even those who attended. We could see their names, but they didn't speak, but we thank them. And we thank all those who are going to watch this session offline or online later.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I just one question. I think, Aditya, you should also expand on this notion of capitalism, a definition of not mode of production. But I think that oftentimes we look at capitalism not as a system that is predicated on appropriation and surplus value extraction. but it seems that we tend to look at it now more so that in terms of exchange, not production, because of the shifting economy from actual production to service and technique. But also the question of socialism. What do we mean by socialism? Ali Shariati says there's only one socialism that could work, that has three dimensions. Again, freedom, equality, and mysticism. Now, when he says mysticism, that's that innate, built-in human dimension that no other species has. Not as a something that you could define the entire culture by, but as something that is really necessary, that can maybe even sort of control that notion of freedom and equality, or sort of mediate. Yeah. Anyway, I thought we should continue with that. I really think that
Thank you.
there's so much misconception about socialism.
Going to say something. Yes, go on, Mehdi.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you so much for this great presentation. I learned a lot. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to read it because I don't have the book. I hope that one of you send me a digital copy.
I'll send it to you.
Looking at Amazon, it's not.
No, don't have to. We'll send you the PDF. I can send you the PDF if I have the email address, but otherwise, Javad. Yes.
And I learned a lot from every one of you. The only thing that I like to just say here, and it's very, very broad, so please don't take it one way or the other. But certainly there is a very delicate balance in using these terms, colonization, decolonization. And as you all have alluded to it, is that it has been also colonized. The term itself, decolonization and decoloniality, has been colonized itself, in the sense, if you use that word, by, of course, we have the radical version of it. I would say radical, just going back to the root and history of liberation and emancipation and the move toward a higher unity, I would say, if there are elements of true decolonization, higher unity and universalism without dismissing the diversities that exist and the equity. But at the same time that we have liberal decolonization right now, which is really taking that bureaucratic, just yes, that delicate balance. I hope that in our writings, we really, focus on that delicate balance of not going to essentializing everything into the native, which is very dangerous, and at the same time, really focusing on the contextualizing all this locality. Anyway, thank you so much. So very much.
Thank you.
Who was the joker here?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.